I built this beautiful chimney all by myself, DIY, and it's only cost me 2300 zloty. I could tell you to stay tuned to see how I fell off the roof, but I won't, because I didn't. I've still got way much work to do, I can't afford to fall off. This house needs to get finished. Before I could start building the chimney, I cleaned the area thoroughly to make sure I had a dust-free surface to work on. If you've been following the project from the beginning, you may remember that I built a separate foundation specifically for the chimney, located where exactly the chimney was planned to go. The first step was to lay down a strip of bitumen membrane to seal the base underneath. The entire floor will be covered with waterproof layer, but for now I'm only sealing the areas where I'm actively building. That way I avoid cutting unnecessary holes on the membrane that could cause problems later on. After a bit of planning and measuring, we headed out to pick up some sand for the mortar with the kids. The first block was laid on a thicker layer of mortar to get it perfectly level. This step was extremely important, so I took my time and made sure everything was just right. Once it was in position, I mixed up some concrete and filled the entire block to create a solid base for the chimney. Whenever I only need a small amount of concrete, I prefer mixing it by hand instead of using the concrete mixer. Cleaning the machine afterwards would take more time than mixing everything manually. My wife and I went through the instructions together, and even though it was our first time, we quickly started feeling confident about what we are doing. Right after finishing the base, I had to cut an opening into the first block, something that will play a key role later on. At first, I assumed the blocks would already come pre-cut, but that definitely wasn't the case. I had to be extra careful because after doing the calculations, I realized I only had one spare block left, meaning I really couldn't afford to crack any of them. At first glance, the blocks didn't look very strong, but after making the first cut, I immediately changed my mind. They were rock solid. The next step was to fill the blocks with concrete up to the front opening, making sure everything was level before moving on. I've cut 2 blocks and created an opening for a door, which will later serve as a maintenance access point for cleaning the chimney. Knowing how durable these blocks are, I was a little rougher with this one. Well, I guess that was my spare block gone. From this point on, there was no room for mistakes at all. It was time for a second round, but before I started cutting the blocks, I called my supplier to check whether these blocks were sold individually or only as full packages. I was pretty sure they sold them separately, but getting confirmation gave me some peace of mind. I knew that if I cracked another one, I could easily get a replacement nearby, so even in the worst case scenario, I wouldn't lose too much time or money. Before we continue, place your bets. How many more blocks do you think I managed to break? The next step was to install the condensate collector tray. It's a delicate piece, so I tried not to drop it and made sure it was in level. All the chimney flues will sit on top of it, so it had to be perfect. I took my time with this step, but eventually it was in place at the end. That was 20 minutes right there, hitting it with a hammer, making small adjustments, and trying to get it perfectly level. The chimney blocks have 4 holes, one on each corner, designed to hold rebar and tie the whole structure together. For now, I place short pieces of rebar in the holes to stop them from filling up with mortar, so I wouldn't have any trouble inserting the full-length bars later on. I mixed up some special glue that came with the chimney system, and I was ready to install the larger piece, which will later serve as the maintenance door. It might look quick and easy in this video, but trust me, that one piece alone could tell a story of struggle, sweat, and a lot more time than I would admit. Now let me show you how I actually got there. First setback, the opening was too small and the door was catching on the brick, preventing the pipe from sitting in place. It was time for some trimming. Then I said to myself, just stick to the instructions, Mark, and stop improvising. It's simple, you just need to do what's written there, so that's what I did. And then I couldn't fit the pipe at all. The insulation wouldn't let it slide down, and because the mortar was still fresh, every bit of force I applied just pushed the whole block out of position. So I had to redo everything again. In the end, it looks like I had to improvise after all. There was simply no way I could fit the pipe with the insulation already inside the blocks, so I ended up sliding the pipe in first and then fitting the insulation around it afterwards. After the struggle at the start, I finally got over the hump and settled into a comfortable pace. Unfortunately, I have a bad habit of doubting myself whenever I do something for the first time, whether it's going well or not. But at that point, I started to believe that success was actually within reach. The next few blocks were pretty straightforward. Glue down a block, place the pipe in the middle, and wrap it with insulation. Of course, I also applied fire-resistant sealant between the pipe sections to prevent any smoke from leaking out. Meanwhile, I kept checking to make sure the chimney was vertical as I worked my way up. Next, I had to make another cut. I really wished I had a larger angle grinder, as it would have made the job much quicker and the cut a lot cleaner, but I hadn't really needed one before, so I didn't want to buy a new tool just for this project. As I worked my way higher, it was finally time to install the T-pipe, where the fireplace flue will connect. This one went a lot smoother than the previous one, that's for sure. At the outlet of the T-pipe, I had to install a piece of insulation around the neck of the pipe. This to allow for thermal expansion, giving the pipe a bit of room to expand and contract as it heats up and cools down. Or at least, that's what the instructions said. By this point, I was already well over 2 meters high, so it was time to install the rebars in the four corners of the blocks. I mixed up some fairly runny glue, poured into the holes, and then pushed the rebars into place. I used different lengths of rebar on purpose, so the joints would be staggered rather than ending at the same point. That way, potentially weak spots would be spread out, resulting in a stronger structure overall. It was getting exciting because I was about to reach the top of the roof. I felt a bit like a hobbit leaving the Shire, setting off into the unknown. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side of that roof line, but it felt like a real adventure. On top of that, the chimney would finally be visible, and another big milestone could be crossed off that list. That moment finally arrived. I reached the membrane and the stress level definitely went up a notch. I wasn't 100% sure if I was cutting the opening at the right place and the right size. My roofing knowledge wasn't exactly at its peak, and I think I'd only watched a handful of videos on the subject. After that, I also had to remove part of the bottom to make room for the chimney to pass through. And then it was time to move outside and work on top of the roof again. By this point, I had already been working on the chimney for a couple of days, but I knew I would need at least one more day to finish it completely before the metal roofing could be installed. I was so close to the finish line, but the last block needed to be cut again, so I decided to leave it for the next day. Once I finished and reached the very top of the chimney, I filled the corner holes with glue and pushed the rebars all the way down. I moved them up and down a few times to make sure the glue filled any gaps around them, then trimmed the rebars back so they wouldn't stick out above the top of the chimney. Then I brought up the last few pieces I needed. First up was the concrete chimney cap. I laid it on a bed of mortar and carefully set it in place. The cap isn't perfectly flat. It's designed with a slight angle so rainwater can drip off the sides. That meant I had to eyeball it and make sure it looked straight. I had a look at the instructions and marked the ceramic pipe. It turned out that it needed to be cut. I was a bit worried it might crack during the process. Thankfully, that wasn't the case at all. The cut went smoothly and everything worked out perfectly. At this point, the chimney was nearly finished, but there was still one more steps to complete before we could finally move on to the metal roofing sheets. There are still a few accessories that need to be installed on the chimney, but those can wait. They aren't needed until the fireplace is actually put into operation, so I decided to leave them for later. For now, the important thing was to finish the outside of the chimney. The metal roofing would eventually be attached around it, so everything had to be properly finalized first. To do that, I bought a few corner beds. These metal profiles create a nice sharp edges and give the chimney a much cleaner finish. They also come with a fiberglass mesh attached to them. Once the mortar is applied, the mesh becomes embedded in it and helps reinforce the surface. In theory, that should make the finish more durable and reduce the chances of cracks appearing later on. Or that's what I hope for. Once the corners were in place, I added a mesh between them as well. I already had a roll of mesh sitting in my container, so the only thing I needed to buy were the corner beds and the render. In total, I spent roughly 100 zloty. I bought 3 bags of render, but in the end I used less than 1 bag to finish the chimney, so at least I have plenty of leftover for future projects. And just like that, this marks my 100th day working on the land, and I've recorded every step of the journey. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing it with your friends. If you'd like to support our project, you can do so for the price of a coffee. Every bit of support hugely appreciated. I'll be back with more updates in 2 weeks, and if you'd like to see more of our journey, make sure to check out our Instagram. Thanks for watching. Mark is out. Peace.